is concerned, you think of it as the journey of the human civilization. So while one may be tempted to glorify it as perhaps the epitome of perfection, I would steer clear of it and to simply call it the journey of the human civilization with all its, let's say, pitfalls and its perfections. So therefore, when you approach any other culture, there is a tendency to, let's say, glorify it. And there is a tendency to add a lot of, let's say, embellishments to it. You don't need to do that with Bhartiya culture for two reasons. One, because at least I believe that it happens to be the oldest. And therefore, like Dharma, instead of looking at it from a value addition perspective as to whether it is good or bad, I would simply say it is what it is. And therefore, if you look at most of our customs, or let's say the way we have structured a society, it has a certain element of being organic, which is to say that you try and meld as much as possible without making too much of a change in individual customs, which makes it possible for you to forge a larger, let's say, identity without having to give up a lot of sub-identities. So, while I'm not a student of anthropology and I certainly cannot claim to be, let's say, an expert on the particular subject, assume for a moment that there was perhaps a racial component to this culture at some point of time, or an ethnocentric component to this culture at some point of time. I think this is perhaps one of the few cultures which was quick enough to give up that particular component and to focus more on consciousness as opposed to race. So therefore, each time whenever we have contentious discussions about, let's say, the Aryan invasion theory, so on and so forth, one attempt is to negate that particular theory, which I think must be done provided there is a scientific basis. But as a lawyer, I would look for a plan B argument, which is that assume for a moment that the Aryan invasion theory is a reality. Let's assume that is indeed the case. So what would be my next question? So what? The question then would be, has this particular culture retained its, let's say, Aryan sense from a racial perspective? Or has it tried to open its doors more from a knowledge and consciousness perspective? In which case, why would you want to crucify the culture, pun intended, on the anvils of race as opposed to its subsequent learnings and its subsequent evolution, so to speak? So, I am not in a position to say that the out of India theory or the out of Africa theory has more evidence than the Aryan invasion theory. That's for subject matter experts to speak. I am happy to proceed with the argument that assuming for a moment it was, let's say, there is an Aryan element to it which is racial in nature. One, it may not have been invasion, it could have been plain and simple immigration, but assuming that there is an invasion, subsequently, is there, let's say, a racial component the way you have in Islam, so to speak, where there is a deification of a particular ethnic identity which continues till date. Okay. So, therefore, according to me, of all the things that Max Muller said, which I don't subscribe to significantly, but the one thing that I certainly think makes a lot of sense is that given the longevity and the sheer, let's say, length of or the duration of this particular culture's journey, so to speak, there are perhaps no mistakes which have been committed here which have not been committed elsewhere. And perhaps there are no better things that we have done which don't exist elsewhere. So the good, bad, and the ugly, they all exist in this particular crucible. So I would see this culture and this particular subcontinent as not just a microcosm, but a macrocosm itself of the universe, or at least of the rest of the world, so to speak. Because given its diversity in terms of geography, given its diversity in terms of facial features and physical features and all sorts of attributes, it is a representation of the world for all practical purposes, and which is why it's a country that, or rather it's a subcontinent that masquerades as a country, which has a serious bearing, including on the way the culture is evolved. Okay, so the one thing that I've tried to tell people wherever possible is, if you look at the way Christianity has gone about appropriating stuff, there is a tendency sometimes to equate Christian appropriation of pre-Christian pagan European culture with the so-called Vedic Hinduism's appropriation of local customs and so on and so forth. That false equivalence and that false symmetry is often drawn. I don't think there is a basis for that at all, because each of these customs continue to have the very same importance that they used to the extent that people have the option of not, let's say, deifying or worshipping Vedic gods, so to speak, and still retaining their allegiance to non-Vedic gods, if at all there is such a distinction. This, according to me, is the single biggest takeaway. I know that there is a lot of, let's say, scope for mischief in the statement that I've just made, but I'm trying to be as clear as possible with a clear caveat that I don't think that the evidence tilts in favor of the Aryan invasion theory, but assuming it does, according to me, it still makes no difference to the fact that we are connected by the umbilical cord called dharma. That cannot be taken away. And given the fact that this particular experiment, so to speak, has worked for over 5,000 years at the very least, and that's a cliched figure which I don't put stock in. Even if that figure is valid, if something has worked for 5,000 years, it is proof of the fact as to why Bharat has significantly retained its dharmic identity despite multiple waves of colonization. That shows that this particular synthesis that we have evolved is a time-tested synthesis, which is why others are going to struggle to try and uproot us.
Okay, thank you.